Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, we're going to be taking a deep dive into one of my favorite SKS variants, which is of course the so-called French Tickler variant of Chinese Type 56 Carbine. Friends on my channel know that I hold the quality of these rifles in extremely high regard, but what you might not know is that they also come with extremely rich historical context, including but not limited to the story of the Type 56 Carbine's ultimate downfall in Chinese military service. That's just one of the subjects I'm going to be covering in this video, however, so without further ado, let's just get right into it. I've already said that the variant we're talking about today is the so-called French Tickler, but that's only partially true. French Tickler is an informal, collector-defined term and a rather crass reference to the texture pattern present on the FRP handguards, which can be found on many but not all Type 56 carbines manufactured at State Arsenal 296 in the late 1970s. Although this handguard is indeed a very distinctive feature, it is not, as I just alluded to, universally present on rifles manufactured in this era. With that in mind, the true subject of this video is the entire final production run of Type 56 carbines at State Arsenal 296, whether or not the fiber-reinforced plastic handguard is present. For the purpose of this video, I will be using the term French Tickler interchangeably with final production run, rather than as a reference to that specific feature. So with that in place, let's flesh out a little bit of early historical context. Viewers of my Steel Harvest video know that I personally break Chinese SKS pattern production into three main eras: the early or Sino-Soviet era, the middle or golden era, and the late or commercial era. The variant we're talking about today, the so-called French Tickler, falls at the very end of the middle era, and one of my goals in this presentation is to impress upon viewers the degree to which this variant does indeed represent the end of an era. So let's weave in more context. As we should already know, Chinese Type 56 carbine production began at State Arsenal 296 in 1956 under Soviet supervision. By 1961, the Chinese had pretty much purged Soviet influence from their country, and nationalistic arms production was in full swing. During the first 15 or so years of production, State Arsenal 296 would go on to produce more SKS pattern carbines than any other factory or country for that matter, and actually did so by a pretty wide margin. Through the later 1960s and 1970s, however, 296 had a secondary mission, which was to decentralize Type 56 carbine production to free up their own resources. They were, after all, one of China's premier arms manufacturers, and as time went on, it became increasingly clear that eventually they would need to shift their focus towards the next generation of Chinese fighting rifles. The Chinese essentially copied the technology transfer template they had received from the Soviets in the 1950s and dispatched teams and technical data packages to existing factories all over China, establishing no less than 25 more fully operational production lines. By the early 1970s, State Arsenal 296 had totally ceased all Type 56 carbine production and was now primarily focused on production of the Type 63 assault rifle. Consequently, the vast majority of Type 56 carbines produced in the 1970s were manufactured at facilities other than State Arsenal 296. Well, as fate would have it, the Type 63 assault rifle was rather poorly received by the PLA, and there was widespread sentiment to bring back the Type 56 carbine. Despite the theoretical force multiplication offered by the select fire detachable box magazine fed Type 63, it lacked the ruggedness, reliability, and simplicity of its humble ancestor. A soldier needs to be able to trust his rifle, and the Type 63 failed to live up to the expectations that the Type 56 carbine had set. This is almost surely why in 1978, State Arsenal 296 dusted off their old tooling, and for one final time, brand new 56s rolled off the line at the most storied and prolific SKS pattern producing factory on Earth. It is those rifles that we are talking about today. Now that we've got some left and right limits set up, let's talk a bit about identification and distinct features. Identification is pretty darn easy. All we really need to look at is receiver markings. We need to see a triangle 26 factory mark, a 3-character Chinese language model designation, and a simple representational date code of 23, 24, or 25, representing the years of 1978, 79, and 1980, respectively. As a brief note, I have seen primary source records indicating that production extended into 1981. However, I have never personally seen a Triangle 26 marked rifle with a 26 date code, so take that with a grain of salt. If you happen to have one, I'd love if you could shoot me a picture. My email is in the description of this video. Either way, you really do just need to have all of those three things, and assuming you do, that's a positive ID right there. Okay, technically there's at least one exception, but I'll get to that in a minute. For now, however, as long as you can establish that you have a Type 56 carbine made at State Arsenal 296 during that production window, you know it belongs to that production block. Pretty simple. So now let's get into distinct features, and let me emphasize again that these are not identification criteria because not all features are present on all rifles. First up, we have the reverse takedown lever tab with corresponding stock relief cut. This feature actually first appeared briefly on State Arsenal 296 carbines produced in the late 1960s, but in the grand scheme of production, it's still a very uncommon feature and definitely something which stands out in this production run. Next, we have this melted profile short barrel lug. Despite the vast majority of mil-spec Type 56 carbine producers having switched to pressed and pinned barrels at this point being the late 1970s, State Arsenal 296 would never adopt this shift. Friends on my channel know that I don't put much weight on the functional differences between different styles of barrel interfaces, but I do find threaded barrels to be more aesthetically pleasing, and this is a particularly attractive interface. One more cool feature to look out for on these rifles is going to be the use of the Roman numeral 3 for the battle setting on the rear sight leaf. Finally, we of course have the FRP or fiber reinforced plastic handguard with its molded texture, which some people find reminiscent of novelty condoms. Like the barrel lug, this is a functionally insignificant but highly aesthetic feature and a cool link to the Type 63 project, for which State Arsenal 296 was primarily motivated to develop this particular material. If you're interested, I have a whole video on the foggy history of Chinese FRP development linked in the description. And that's all I'm going to say for now about distinct features, although near the end of this video, I will talk a little bit more about overall quality, because as you might have already deduced from looking at these images, that's definitely a highlight with these rifles. For now, let's just circle back to that exception I brought up earlier. Looking at this rifle, you would probably think we're looking at a normal French Tickler. Heck, you might think this is the same rifle we've been looking at this whole video, when in fact it isn't. Believe it or not, this rifle does not have a single one of the 3 identification criteria I laid out earlier, which again were a triangle 26 factory marking, a Chinese language model designation, and a simple representational date code. And the reason for that is because this is a 1979 State Arsenal 296 produced M21 manufactured for export and therefore has a totally different set of markings. Instead of a triangle 26 factory mark, it has a 0296. Instead of a Chinese language model designation, it has a Latin M21. And instead of a simple representational date code, it has a complex direct date code. Markings aside, this rifle is totally indistinguishable from my 1979 Type 56 carbine and absolutely belongs to this larger production block. It just doesn't happen to conform to the otherwise straightforward identification criteria I laid out earlier. And that's kind of how it goes with Chinese rifles. There are some very good and reliable rules of thumb, but when in doubt, there will always be an exception, and this is a great example of that. At the end of the day, the rules just point us in the right direction, and sometimes we need to be flexible enough to read between the lines. All right, so we've covered some solid territory so far, so now let's get into the good part and start talking about why these rifles truly represent the end of an era. When we left our story, the Chinese had resumed Type 56 carbine production at State Arsenal 296, and we explained why they did that. What we didn't explain is why they promptly stopped again just a few years later, and why that final cessation of production was so significant that it marks the end of what I consider to be the middle or golden era of production. In order to understand that part of the story, we need to talk about the Vietnam War, but not just the Vietnam War that you might be thinking of. What many of us know as the Vietnam War, and Vietnamese people know as the American War, is also known as the Second Indochina War, and our main takeaway from that is that there were a few of these things. Many people are also familiar with the First Indochina War or the Franco-Vietnamese War, but today we are actually focusing on the Third Indochina War, an often ignored but hugely significant period in Southeast Asian geopolitics. The reality is that the disappearance of American and Anzac helicopters from the jungle canopy did not mark the end of fighting in and around Vietnam, and instead marked the beginning of the Third Indochina War. In order to understand the Third Indochina War, we need to talk about Cambodia for a minute. At the peak of U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the late 1960s, the North Vietnamese Army, as well as the Viet Cong, had made significant incursions into the Kingdom of Cambodia in order to try to maneuver troops and equipment outside of the range of American airstrikes. This did not have its intended effect, as Richard Nixon's White House utterly disregarded the American Constitution, as well as the Geneva suggestions, by unilaterally ordering Strategic Air Command to launch Operation Menu, a non-congressionally authorized carpet bombing campaign in which more than 100,000 tons of ordnance was intentionally dropped into a neutral country. The unintended consequences of this whole situation were monumental and wide-reaching, and 3 of those consequences are particularly relevant to us today. First, the U.S. bombing campaign deepened an existing rift between Vietnam and Cambodia. Although the Cambodian people had no shortage of well-deserved anger towards the Americans who were actually dropping the bombs, they also recognized that the Vietnamese held tremendous culpability. After all, the Vietnamese had profoundly violated Cambodian neutrality by using Cambodian territory in their campaign against the American war machine. Second, the U.S. bombing campaign was a massive destabilizing force, which directly contributed to the collapse of the Cambodian kingdom and the rise of democratic Kampuchea and the Khmer Rouge. Democratic Kampuchea was a leftist totalitarian hellscape which made North Korea look like a nice vacation spot. In the name of Leninist communism, they embarked on a campaign of genocidal social restructuring that was, without any doubt, one of the most depraved acts of organized human savagery in modern history. Unsurprisingly, the Khmer Rouge's fanatically literal adherence to Marxist ideology earned them a close ally in the Chinese, which further put them at odds with the Soviet-aligned Vietnamese. Third and finally, the U.S. bombing campaign normalized extreme violence and mass death in Cambodian politics. As we know, implementation of extreme left-wing political theory will almost inevitably result in mass death, but it's particularly dangerous when introduced to a population which has been desensitized to killing. The Cambodian genocide under communist rule was horrifyingly efficient, as indeed they managed to kill approximately 1/4 of their entire population in less than half a decade, to include virtually all ethnic Vietnamese people living in democratic Kampuchea. With all that in place, the context for the Third Indochina War is pretty self-explanatory. By the fall of Saigon in 1975, the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam and democratic Kampuchea were heavily armed, conditioned to violence, and deeply at odds with one another. Ethnic Vietnamese refugees flooded over the border into Vietnam, bringing stories of executions and mass graves. Cambodian troops followed closely behind, finally repaying the Vietnamese for their past border incursions by themselves crossing the border in the other direction, killing Vietnamese civilians, and claiming what they believed to be ancestral Khmer territory. Cambodian and Vietnamese troops regularly engaged in border skirmishes, and an intra-communist proxy war between the far-left Chinese-backed Cambodians and the more moderate Russian-backed Vietnamese slowly began to heat up. Hostile rhetoric reached a fever pitch when the psychotic propaganda wing of the Khmer Rouge called for the total extermination of the Vietnamese people, and in 1978, Vietnam responded with a full-scale invasion of democratic Kampuchea. Long story short, the Khmer Rouge proved they were better at killing unarmed political prisoners than they were at actually fighting enemy combatants, and the battle-hardened Vietnamese forces steamrolled through Kampuchea with ease. The shattered remnants of the Khmer Rouge fled to Thailand, while Vietnam occupied and installed a new regime in the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh. And finally, at long last, this is when China gets involved. Although the CCP was powerless to preserve the regime of their Red allies in Cambodia, they did in 1979 launch their own retaliatory invasion of Vietnam with the express intent of punishing the Vietnamese for their own invasion of Cambodia. Unlike the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, the Chinese invasion of Vietnam was anything but decisive. It is generally considered to have resulted in status quo antebellum, or no meaningful changes from the pre-war conditions. China basically just marched into Vietnam, fought a bunch of pointless battles, killed tens of thousands of Vietnamese, sustained tens of thousands of deaths themselves, burned a bunch of croplands, and then left. They did not take any territory, nor did they negotiate the end of Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. They really did just fight for the sake of fighting for a few weeks. Both sides claimed victory in this war, and while there's a seed of truth in both claims, it was truly one of the least productive losses of life in a region which had already been ravaged by decades of largely pointless wars. Okay, so what does all this have to do with the French Tickler variant of Type 56 carbine and the end of the golden era of Chinese SKS production? The thing is, despite the total lack of strategic objectives in the Sino-Vietnamese War, it was an extremely influential turning point in the evolution of the People's Liberation Army. After all, this was really the first serious engagement for the Chinese military since they had faced American troops on the Korean Peninsula a quarter century earlier. It's not uncommon for countries to get a rude awakening when they return to combat after decades of peace, and that is certainly what happened to China and Vietnam. Bypassing the reductive question of winning or losing, what is abundantly clear is that the Chinese military underperformed in Vietnam, and this underperformance was the result of outdated equipment and tactics. The PLA was still structured to fight according to the Maoist People's War doctrine of ultralight guerrilla warfare, which makes absolutely no sense in the context of a modern invasion force, especially when we remember that at this moment in time, the Vietnamese defenders actually understood this exact Maoist doctrine of warfare better than anyone else on the planet. The Chinese needed combined arms, mechanization, and fire superiority, and because they didn't know how to fight that way yet, they defaulted to human wave tactics. In fairness, most records seem to indicate that the poorly equipped Chinese troops fought fiercely. However, their kill-to-loss ratio was approximately 1-to-1 for the duration of the war. And when you compare that to the US's 40-to-1 ratio against the exact same adversary, you can appreciate just how unimpressive the Chinese military show-in really was. Long story short, the PLA underperformed in Vietnam and leadership got the message. They recognized that they had finally outgrown their guerrilla roots and accepted the reality that tomorrow's war would not be the global peasant revolution prophesied by Marx. In the immediate aftermath of the Sino-Vietnamese War, and we're talking about weeks or months here, the PLA formally shifted to a new military doctrine they called the People's War under Modern Conditions and began to modernize all aspects of their military. One of the most obvious and immediate consequences of this ambitious and wide-reaching program was to stop tiptoeing around the aging Type 56 carbine and officially retire it from frontline service. The Type 56 carbine had been a phenomenal weapon for use by ultralight guerrilla infantry on asymmetric battlefields, but as China outgrew the People's War, so too had they outgrown the People's Rifle. Now, that's not to say the Type 56 carbine had been a liability in Vietnam. In fact, both sides used it to great effect, but the writing was on the wall. Assault rifles chambered in small diameter high velocity cartridges like the US M16 and Soviet AK-74 were clearly the path forward, and China had no reason to delay the inevitable. Modernizations to artillery, armor, aircraft, and logistics were surely far more consequential in the long run, but that's not to say that small arms should have been neglected. In any case, the Chinese relationship with the Type 56 carbine transformed practically overnight. It went from being the stubbornly viable, well-liked de facto workhorse of the PLA to being a rifle which was seen more for reserve units and export purposes. In fact, as friends of this channel know, 1980, the year right after the Sino-Vietnamese War, was the same year that Norinco was incorporated, and the Chinese military-industrial complex began to monetize their vast production infrastructure, with the recently obsolete Type 56 carbine being one of their flagship products. And the kick that set all of this in motion was the Chinese experience in Vietnam as part of the Third Indochina War, which hopefully you all now have some more context for. So back to these rifles. How do these rifles exhibit all of that history? On the most obvious level, we know from their date range that these were the rifles being made immediately before, during, and immediately after that war. But we can tell that from more than just the dates of the rifles. Another dead giveaway is the condition. The vast majority of so-called French Tickler carbines were imported in nearly perfect unissued condition, and many remain in that condition today. That's not unusual for Chinese commercial rifles or refurbs, but it's very unusual for original military models. That said, it makes perfect sense when we consider the history we just went over. The PLA that ordered these rifles didn't exist by the time that they were delivered, because the PLA was radically transformed by war. Put bluntly, the Chinese went into 1979 thinking that they needed more Type 56 carbines. That's why they ordered this contract. And they ended that year with the cold understanding that they actually already had way too many. These are military rifles, which in most cases were never even sent out to units and were instead delivered straight to Norinco for exportation. That's why I say they represent the end of an era. They straddled the gap between the golden era of military production and the late era of commercial production. Everything made before them was made in defense of the Chinese state, and pretty much everything made after them was made for sale on foreign markets. And that's pretty much how they fit into the larger story of Chinese SKS production, so now let's bang out a few collector considerations before we go ahead and close out. I won't beat around the bush. These are, in my opinion, one of the highest quality SKS variants on the planet. That doesn't mean they shoot straighter or tougher than any other variant, but it does mean that they're extremely refined, aesthetically appealing, and very smooth operating. Honestly, I would put these things in a tie with the early Yugo M59s for the top spot in terms of overall quality for an SKS variant. So what puts them there? Look for yourself. The wood tends to have great grain, the fitment is usually perfect, the bluing is deep and rich, and the machining is boringly precise. It certainly doesn't hurt that most of them were imported in unissued condition, but it runs much deeper than that. Keep in mind that by any measure, these rifles were the encore production run of the most experienced SKS producer in human history, and that's by a lot. State Arsenal 296 made more SKS patterns than the rest of the world combined, and given that these rifles belonged to their final production run, they were able to lean on every ounce of that experience while manufacturing these rifles. Also, I'd be remiss to not mention that these rifles somehow exude a very hard to pin down, but distinctly nostalgic 1970s feel that really reminds me of old Marlin lever guns from the same era. It might sound weird, but this really does feel like a Soviet SKS 45 and a 1973 Marlin Model 1894 Cowboy had a baby, and I mean that in the best way possible. Something about the combination of perfect wood fitment, deep blued steel and bakelite just screams 1970s US of A, and as objectively anachronistic as that is, I love it. As one final note, I will say that I have found these rifles to disproportionately exhibit above average triggers. I can't be sure that's representative of a larger trend. My sample size of ones that I've fired is probably less than 5, to be honest, but it is what I've noticed, so I'm mentioning it. So should you get one of these things? Absolutely. What they lack in direct military provenance, I think they more than make up for in terms of beauty and build quality, not to mention they still tell a pretty cool story. I wouldn't pay a crazy premium for one of these things, but I absolutely think they are worth a little more than a run-of-the-mill Type 56 carbine from the 1960s or 70s, maybe an extra 20-25% or so. Luckily, they aren't too hard to find in that price range, and honestly, that's a pretty modest surcharge for what may well prove to be the nicest SKS you ever own. One final thing I will add is that these rifles were overwhelmingly imported without bayonets, so while some prospective customers might be turned off by seeing these for sale without a bayonet, that can actually be a good sign with this specific variant. It might mean that nobody's touched it or messed with it much. Both of my rifles here were purchased packed in cosmoline and without bayonets, so I just slapped a couple of standard cruciform bayonets on there and called it a day. And that's the video, guys. As always, I hope you found it to be worth your time. If you did enjoy this video and want to see more like it, I encourage you to check out my SKS playlist. There's a solid base of information there, and I'm adding to it all the time. If you want to support my work on this channel, the easiest way to do so is to hit any combination of like, subscribe, or comment. That's what grows this channel, and that's what motivates me to keep going. So one last time, thanks so much for taking the time to check out this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.